Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be diving into a conflict that a lot of folks might not know much about, but it's one that has a lot to teach us about American history.
Definitely.
The Dakota War of 1862.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a ton of sources lined up for this deep dive.
Nice.
We're talking trial transcripts, first-hand accounts,
Wow.
all sorts of stuff just waiting to be unpacked.
Can't wait to dig in.
So buckle up, because this is a story filled with broken promises, cultural clashes, and ultimately a fight for survival.
You know what's really interesting about this conflict?
What's that?
It really kind of blows apart that simple cowboys and Indians story that we often get.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean.
It's not really a story of heroes and villains,
Right.
but more about what happens when westward expansion runs right into a people who are already there.
Who called this land home long before any settlers arrived.
Exactly.
So we're going to take you deep into the Dakota perspective.
Okay.
Explore their culture, the pressures they face.
Sounds good.
Imagine having to give up your ancestral lands, promised certain things in return,
Yeah.
only to have those promises broken over and over again.
It's heartbreaking to read about what the Dakota people went through.
It really is.
Dwindling resources, broken treaties, not getting the annuities they were promised.
You know, I bet a lot of our listeners might not be familiar with that term, annuities.
Right.
Can you break that down for us a bit?
Sure.
What exactly were those, and why were they so important in this conflict?
So basically, annuities were these payments,
Okay,
often in the form of goods and money,
got it.
that the U.S. government promised Native American tribes.
In exchange for?
Well, in exchange for huge amounts of land that they gave up in these treaties.
Ah, so it wasn't like a free gift.
No, not at all.
They were forced into these treaties.
Often, yeah.
And the annuities were supposed to be crucial for their survival.
Right, especially since they were being pushed onto smaller and smaller reservations with fewer resources.
So basically, breaking those annuity agreements wasn't just breaking a promise.
No, it was directly impacting their ability to live.
To survive.
Exactly.
And that feeling of betrayal, that frustration, it must have built up over years.
You can see in the sources, by 1862, tensions were incredibly high.
It's like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
And then you have this one incident.
The killing of 5 white settlers by 4 Dakota hunters.
Right, often seen as the thing that started the war.
But is it really that simple?
Probably not.
But-
That incident, yeah, it was tragic.
Absolutely.
But it was really the result of everything that had been building up for decades.
The broken treaties, the dwindling resources, all of it.
All of it.
It's also important to remember that the Dakota perspective on this event was totally different
Oh, yeah.
from how it was portrayed in newspapers and such.
Absolutely.
So we can't look at it as some random act of violence.
No.
We need to see it in the bigger picture of what was happening.
The context of everything.
Exactly.
The sources show that the Dakota felt like this was it.
A breaking point.
Yeah, they were pushed to the brink.
They felt like their entire way of life was at stake.
Absolutely. Their survival was on the line.
And this is where Little Crow comes in.
Ah, Little
A
Crow.
really fascinating figure in all of this.
He was
A Dakota leader
right.
known for being able to understand both Dakota and white cultures.
He walked between two worlds.
And at first, he resisted calls for war.
He did. He understood what they were up against.
Going to war with the U.S. government, that's a losing battle 9 times out of 10.
It is. He knew what could happen.
He didn't want to see his people suffer.
But at the same time, he was facing a lot of pressure from his people.
Oh, I can imagine.
You see it in his speeches, this incredible internal conflict.
He was torn between what he knew was right and what his people were demanding.
Absolutely. In one of his speeches, there's this line that always gets me.
What is it?
He says, "Tayateduda is not a coward. He will die with you."
Wow, just chills.
Yeah, you can really feel the weight on his shoulders.
The responsibility he felt to lead his people.
Even if it meant leading them into a fight, they were likely to lose.
That's got to be one of the hardest decisions anyone can make.
It is. He was a tragic figure in many ways,
He really was.
caught between trying to keep the peace and protecting his people.
And in the end, he decided to stand with his people.
He did.
And that decision launched the Dakota War.
It did.
6 weeks of brutal fighting.
So much loss on both sides.
But even in all that chaos,
Yeah.
there are stories of individuals who defied expectations.
Who showed compassion.
People like Sarah Wakefield.
And Chask.
Can you tell us about them?
So Sarah Wakefield was a white settler who was captured during the war.
Oh, wow.
And Chask, even though he was on the other side of the conflict,
He was Dakota.
he risked his own life to protect Sarah and her children.
That's incredible.
It really shows you that even in the middle of a war, there's still humanity.
That there's more to the story than just fighting.
Exactly.
So what happened to Chask after the war?
That's where things take a bit of a turn. We'll have to dig into that after a quick break.
Oh, good.
Chask's story, it really shows you that there was another side to the Dakota War.
A side we don't often hear about?
Exactly. His choice to protect Sarah Wakefield and her kids,
Yeah.
even with everything going on around them.
Right in the middle of a war.
It really challenges that image of the Dakota people as just being violent.
As being the enemy.
Right. It shows that there were individuals making their own choices.
Choices based on compassion.
Yeah.
So after the war, what happened to Chask?
Well, that's where things get really tragic.
What do you mean?
So after the war ended, there were all these trials.
Right, for the Dakota men who fought.
Exactly. And from what we see in the sources,
Yeah.
these trials, they weren't exactly fair.
How so?
A lot of the Dakota men, they didn't have lawyers.
Oh, wow.
And they didn't really understand the legal system.
It's like they were set up to fail.
It really was a tough situation.
Especially since they were already seen with suspicion.
Just because of who they were.
Yeah.
And in the end, over 300 Dakota men were sentenced to death.
300? That's unbelievable.
It was a huge number. Even President Lincoln was shocked.
Wow, and this was all happening during the Civil War.
Right in the middle of it.
So the country was already in turmoil.
It was a crazy time, but Lincoln, he actually took the time to look over the trial records himself.
Really? He personally reviewed them?
He did. He wanted to make sure justice was being served.
That's pretty incredible that he prioritized this.
Especially with everything else going on.
So what did he find when he reviewed those records?
Well, he found that a lot of the convictions were really shaky.
Like they didn't have enough evidence?
Exactly. Or they were based on confessions that were probably coerced.
Oh, wow.
So he ended up commuting most of the sentences.
So he reduced the number of executions.
He did. He only allowed 38 to go through.
But I bet he faced a lot of pressure to just uphold all the sentences.
Yeah, there were a lot of people who wanted to see all those men hanged.
But he stood his ground.
He did. He believed that mercy was important too.
Even in the middle of a war.
Even then.
So Lincoln saw this as a really important issue.
He didn't just brush it aside.
He really wanted to make sure justice was done.
He did, but even with his intervention,
Yeah.
there was still a lot of tragedy.
We're talking about Chaskey, aren't you?
Yeah, despite everything he did to protect Sarah Wakefield,
Yeah.
despite her testimony for him,
What happened?
he ended up being one of the men who was executed.
Oh, no.
It seems like there was some kind of clerical error.
A mistake?
Yeah, his name ended up on the list of those to be hanged, even though he was supposed to be spared.
That's awful. To be punished for something you didn't do.
And especially after he showed so much compassion.
It's just heartbreaking.
It really makes you wonder how many other innocent men might have been caught up in all of this.
Just swept up in the system.
Exactly.
So even though the war was over,
Yeah.
it wasn't really over for the Dakota people.
Not at all.
What happened to them?
Well, all the treaties they had with the U.S. government were thrown out.
Just like that.
Gone, and they were forced to leave their ancestral lands.
They were exiled from Minnesota.
Yeah. They were sent to reservations in other states, or they fled to Canada.
Thousands of them.
It was a mass exodus.
Just imagine being ripped from your home.
Everything you know?
Your way of life.
It's a loss that runs deep.
A wound that takes generations to heal.
And it wasn't just about the land.
No.
They lost their culture, their language, their connection to their homeland.
It was a huge turning point in their history.
One they're still dealing with today.
So this wasn't just a war between two groups.
No, it was much bigger than that.
It was about different cultures clashing, different ways of life.
And it was a reflection of the power dynamics at play.
Who had the power and who didn't.
Exactly. We've talked about Little Crow and Chask and Sarah Wakefield.
Yeah, powerful stories.
They were, but there are so many other individual stories from this conflict.
Stories that can teach us so much.
Exactly. Are there any that stand out to you?
Yeah, it seems like every story we look at adds a whole new layer to this.
It really does. It's not just about the big battles or the treaties.
Right. It's about the real people who lived through it.
Exactly. And one story that really highlights that is the mass execution.
The 38 Dakota men who were hanged.
Yeah, the sources talk about it being this huge spectacle.
Like a public display.
Yeah, they even moved the location of the executions.
From Mankato to New Ulm.
Right, to a town that had been attacked during the war.
So it was a deliberate choice.
Oh yeah, it was all about sending a message.
To the Dakota people.
To anyone who might even think about rebelling.
A show of force.
And the sources describe the condemned men singing their death songs.
Wow, just imagining that moment gives me chills.
It's powerful stuff. It shows the strength of the Dakota people.
Even facing death.
Their songs weren't just about sadness, they were about who they were.
About their culture.
Exactly, their connection to their ancestors.
So even in death, they held on to their traditions.
They did, but the disrespect didn't stop there.
What do you mean?
Even after the executions, the sources say that their bodies were treated horribly.
Like they weren't even human.
It's really disturbing. Their graves were robbed, their remains were used for research.
It's just awful.
It shows how dehumanized they were seen as less than.
As obstacles in the way of progress.
Savages to be controlled.
Not as people deserving of respect.
It's a dark part of our history.
It really is. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm filled with a lot of sadness.
I understand it's hard to hear about the suffering.
But I also feel like we have to learn from this.
We do. We can't let something like this happen again.
The Dakota War. It's a reminder of what can happen when promises are broken.
When injustice goes unchecked.
It forces us to ask some hard questions.
About justice, about reconciliation.
About our responsibility to make things right.
It's not just about the past.
No, it's about the present and the future too.
We have to learn from history so we can build a better future.
A more just future.
For everyone.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
I agree. We've learned so much about the Dakota War.
About the people who lived through it.
About the difficult truths of our nation's history.
And I hope it's inspired you to keep learning.
To look for more information.
To talk about these issues with others.
Because this is a conversation we need to keep having.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this journey.
It's been a privilege to share this story with you.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the past.
Until then, keep exploring.